Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries. I'm your host, John. As I've said before, we record these a little bit in advance, and I'm recording this on a Monday evening after finishing work. And I thought, well, since I'm feeling pretty tired and zombified myself, it might be a good idea to talk about how you could maybe use zombie hordes and take inspiration from them in your D&D games. So I'm going to assume that we're all familiar with zombie films, and media, Brains, etc. George Romero's films and stuff like that. You know the drill. When there's no more room in hell, the dead shall walk the earth. Dead start rising from their graves, infecting people or killing them and turning them into zombies themselves, and seeking to eat the living. Although not brains quite so much originally specifically, but the disease is normally passed on by like a bite or sort of exchange of bodily fluids and stuff like that. There's been various iterations of them, from like running high-speed rage zombies to the shambling corpses of yesteryear. So you might be saying, well, zombies exist in D&D. Dead easy to do a zombie horde in D&D. Well, yeah, it is from a certain perspective. However, there's a few things to my mind that make the sort of whole idea of a zombie apocalypse so scary. And the first is that it's unknown. No one really knows what causes it. Generally, the most you get normally is like, oh, it's some sort of generic gas, or it's some sort of virus or something like that. There's never really like a deep explanation, and a lot of zombie films don't even really explain it at all. The second thing is the fact that the infection can spread so rapidly, and that anyone around you could have been infected and they could have become a zombie themselves. The third thing for me is the fact that the zombie horde represents this endless, implacable, unstoppable foe. They're not attacking you because they hate you, because they have differences with you. They're just running on sort of animal, in some cases, instinct, and they just form this huge surging tide of corpses that sort of roll forward, adding to their numbers with every victim that falls before them. You can kill as many of them as you like, but there's as many of them potentially as there is of us. We also see in some of George Romero's, particularly Dawn of the Dead, you see sort of vague echoes where zombies sort of do things that they might have been doing in their mortal lives. Even though the sort of intelligence isn't there, the instinct is there, and you see zombies shambling around malls and stuff like that, acting out in part some of the stuff they did while they're alive in a sort of grisly Half-Life display, as though mocking or perhaps yearning for the life they once had. But at least in most of these films, they can never go back to being what they were. And I think that's quite a scary thing as well. So what's the problem with running a zombie apocalypse in D&D? Well, as I said earlier, first of all, zombies already exist in D&D. They're created by magic. There's spells that can create them. They can be turned by clerics or controlled if you're like a bit more of the dark side cleric. So they don't really have the same sort of punch that they do in a sort of a zombie apocalypse film or fiction. Also in D&D, we tend to be in a world where monsters exist. There's various different types of creatures. There's various different strains of undead. So they don't have the same impact that they do in a modern day setting, which is ostensibly based on our reality. And then stuff goes south really quickly as this zombie apocalypse starts ramping up. So you might be saying, well, okay, so obviously we can't run a zombie apocalypse in that style. And I don't think you can 100% run one in the same style as like Dawn of the Dead or something like that. For instance, if you have a huge horde of zombies rolling across your campaign world, you've got wizards, clerics, adventurers who've probably faced far more than that. So the impact of that is greatly lessened in your game. However, I do think there's a few things you can do to try and sort of get that idea across. And I'm going to refer back to the reasons why I think these zombie media are particularly unsettling as I do so. So let's look at that first reason that I gave, the fear of the unknown, of no one knowing what causes the zombie plague. Well, that's probably one of the easiest to replicate in a D&D game, where you just don't give any explanation as to how it's occurred. And the players will obviously speculate, because they'll say, oh, maybe it's like an evil wizard, maybe it's a lich, maybe it's an evil cleric, maybe it's a death god, something like that. But as long as you keep the sort of background of it nebulous and the sort of source of the infection nebulous, then it becomes more unsettling. Because after all, if you 100% identify and go, yes, it's that evil lich that caused it, you can go and tonk the lich with your +8 broadsword or whatever, and then deal with the fallout. And yet, it might be a challenge to go and take this guy down, but it's not really unnerving, it's not unsettling, it's just another monster, another bag of hit points to be tonked by the might of the player party. So I would advise, if you want to do that whole zombie plague sort of thing, keep the source of it nebulous. And you might decide on what the reason is in your game, but you don't have to reveal it to the player characters, unless you want to. But for my money, the unknown is one of the things that really makes this have an impact in a game. The second point we raised was about the rate of infection and how someone who gets bitten tends to sicken shortly afterwards before dying and eventually rising as a zombie themselves. Now, this can vary depending on whatever inspirational media you're looking at, but we already have a good example of how this can work in D&D. After all, we have things like wraiths and vampires who can ostensibly procreate, if you want to use that term, by draining the life out of people, and when they've drained all of their life out, they rise again as sort of lesser undead under the control of their creators. The main difference between that sort of thing and a zombie apocalypse is, in this situation, you don't need to have all of your levels drained before you come back as one of these creatures. Just a bite, something that breaks the skin, is enough. Now, depending on how sort of lethal you want your game to be, might determine how sort of heavily you want to lean into this idea. After all, if you're running an old school role-playing game and death's around every corner, you can get taken out by the first goblin arrow that hits you or whatever, you might say, yeah, you get hit by a zombie, it bites you or whatever, then that's it, you're infected. You've only got a few hours left unless you get some heavy duty healing magic. And whether it can be healed, again, is down to the specific of your campaign world and how heavily you want to lean into this. Also, if you want to be a little bit more lenient, you could allow a constitution save or something similar to that to shrug off the effects. Although, if you want to sort of keep it to the sort of media, what I would suggest is basically only have every other attack that the zombie does be a bite attack. So the other could be either just bludgeoning them with a stick or something like that, or their fists, and that might not pass on the infection. And you can always make it clear when they go for the bite attack, and it's those attacks you need to be really careful for. That element of additional uncertainty can really sort of ramp up the tension when your players come to fight a group of these infected zombies. After all, if you know as a player going into any encounter with a group of zombies that you can just wade through them with merry abandon and your broadsword and you can deal with them, that's not a problem. However, if you go in and all it's going to take is one of those bite attacks to get through my armour and hit me, then I could be joining the undead horde myself. It's going to cause you to at least think twice, or preferably actually try and plan your way around it, maybe armour up a little bit more. And player characters have an advantage in this sort of scenario, because when we see people in zombie media, they don't tend to have access to armour and stuff like that, whereas obviously the player characters in your typical D&D game do have armour. But hopefully it'll give them a little bit of pause for thought, and again inject just a little bit of uncertainty into any encounter with the horde. Another good way to further emphasise how quickly this infection spreads and how dangerous it is to have NPCs or people like villagers and whatever that the players meet, have them go down as the zombies are attacking. And you see that scene that's so sort of iconic of zombie media, where someone gets taken down by the zombies, and as the players like fight the zombie off, the guy's like thrashing around on the floor and foaming at the mouth as the infection's taking over him, and a few moments later he or she also rises up as a zombie. So you can also demonstrate it by like having NPCs etc fall to it without necessarily just going straight for the jugular on your player characters. But again, it's a matter of personal taste and what suits your campaign. And now we come to the final point that I initially mentioned, which is that of the overwhelming nature of the zombie horde, that it can grow almost exponentially, because as we said earlier, every person they take down is essentially another person getting zombified and added to the horde. So when you fight against these creatures, I would advise potentially actually making their stats weaker individually, but you should never be individually facing a single zombie. You should be facing, 20, 25, 30 or even more of these creatures. But you don't want to have to spend all your time like slogging through all of these creatures. That's not really the point of facing off against this type of horde. So I would say actually make them weaker individually, and the easiest way to do that is just lower their hit points of each zombie down to like 1 hit point or something like that. So yeah, as your warrior goes in, with every blow he's dropping zombies at left, right and centre, but all it really takes is one of those to get that bite attack in on him, and he could be in deep trouble. And because you've done this and the zombies individually aren't really that sort of potent, you can afford to throw more of them at the player characters without it sort of bogging down the game or bringing it to a halt. If you've got games that use swarm rules or stuff like that, you may even want to look at adapting the swarm rules. So instead of having individual zombies, you have just like a huge swarm of them. I think that could work pretty well if your version of D&D Pathfinder or whatever has some swarm rules. Maybe wheel them out, give them a little tweak or a little bit of a reskin and use those for zombies. Also, if you're fighting against these zombies in an area where there are people, like in the middle of a village or something like that, as we said earlier, with every person they kill, they will be effectively adding to their numbers. So I think if there's loads of like sort of like level 0 villagers about, then feasibly every round you could just like roll a d6 and be like, oh, that's how many like villagers have been zombified this round. And the player characters will have to sort of deal with it quickly before the horde grows out of their ability to manage. And I think that sort of siege style scenario where you're trying to take shelter or you're trying to take them down quickly before their numbers grow beyond your ability to deal with could be really tense. But as I say, you need to keep an eye on the pacing and make sure it doesn't just dissolve into a big combat slog. So there we go. There's a few ideas from me for running a sort of zombie horde inspired by the various zombie apocalypse media that we've seen in a D&D game. Have you got any ideas how you could run such a thing in your game? What do you think of the ideas I've just given? Like them, love them, hate them, whatever. If you want to call in and let us know, maybe be featured in a future voicemail episode, you can get in touch a number of ways. You can send us a voicemail to SpeakPipe or Anchor. There's a link to the description down below. Or you could send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. So until we see you again, take care, stay safe, and whenever you're playing, have fun.